I've recently had to move to another city due to work. My family and I, which consists of me, my wife, and my 9-year-old son Dylan, were suddenly uprooted from our quiet life and had to move to a busier city, which none of us were used to. My wife had to find another job in the city, and my son had to leave his friends behind and start at a new school, which I had hoped would all be worth it for the sizable pay raise I was receiving. We've been moved into our new house for about a month now, and everyone seems to be adjusting to the new lifestyle that we have now. My wife has found a new job, which she enjoys, and she has made a number of new friends there. My son is also settled in well to the new school. He's in the 3rd grade, and due to being in a busier city, is in a larger class than he's used to. I don't think he minds though. He has already made a few friends that have helped him adjust to the new school. His teacher, Mrs. Wagner, was a young woman, who Dylan seemed to really like. He would always come home and tell me and my wife about the fun he had at school and the fun lessons that Mrs. Wagner would teach. I had only met her the one time when I dropped Dylan off at school on the first day, and as far as I could tell, she was a very nice lady. Every night Dylan would come home with different homework that he would have to complete before school the next day. I'm not a massive fan of homework, but it seems like the homework that Mrs. Wagner always set was quite simple tasks that could easily be completed in a night. One night, Dylan had to find out what their parents did for work and ask 3 questions about their job. And another night, he had to research their favorite animal and find out 3 interesting things about it. It was always simple tasks like that, or it was simple worksheets that Dylan could complete in a half hour or so. Every night, I would ask Dylan what his homework was for that night, and then I would help him with it if he needed. That's when I noticed the homework becoming a little bit strange. One night, in Dylan's 3rd week of being in the new class, he came home looking upset. I asked him when he entered the kitchen what was wrong, and he told me that everything was okay. I then asked him what his homework was for that night, and he told me that he didn't have any for that night. This was surprising because he had some sort of homework task every single night he had been in Mrs. Wagner's class, so it was strange that he suddenly didn't. Dylan then left the kitchen and went into his room, shutting the door behind himself. He didn't usually close the door, but I thought that he must have wanted some privacy. I could tell though that something was wrong, but he didn't want to tell me. Dylan spent most of the night in his room, apart from dinner time, when me and my wife told him he had to sit at the dinner table with us. He seemed to be in a better mood during dinner and was fairly talkative and making jokes like he normally did. After dinner though, he went back into his room and closed the door. We decided to let him stay in there for a while, but after an hour or two, I went in to see him and let him know that it was time to go to bed. I walked down into his room, opened the door, and when I looked inside, I saw that he had already fallen asleep over his workbook. I quietly walked over to him to gently wake him and move him to his bed, but that's when I saw it, the homework task that was set for the night. The title that was written in Dylan's workbook was, "Would I Miss My Parents If I No Longer Lived With Them?" At first I was taken aback. This was a very weird task to set for a group of 9 and 10-year-olds. I didn't really know how to react to this. I continued to read to see what else he had written. He had written, "I would miss both my mom and dad very much. I love both of them a lot and they help me with everything. I love spending dinner time with them, but I would probably love someone else as much as them if I had to, like you were saying today, Mrs. Wagner." When I read the final sentence, I felt chills down my spine. I would probably love someone else as much as them if I had to. The words struck me like a brick to the face. What had Mrs. Wagner been telling my son? What was the purpose of telling him these things? I decided, probably stupidly, not to tell my wife about what I had found. She would worry, and she probably had a right to worry, but I didn't want to concern her. I decided that I would instead confront Mrs. Wagner tomorrow and ask her about this strange homework task. The next day, I took Dylan to school like I normally do, except this time, I got out and walked up to the classroom with him. I saw Mrs. Wagner alone in the classroom as I entered the room, and she greeted me with a smile. "Hey, how are you?" she said as I entered the classroom. "How is Dylan settling in?" I answered that he was settling in well, but I did have 1 or 2 concerns. She asked what they were, and so I explained. "I was just curious about the homework you set yesterday, the one about how much they would miss their parents. I'm just concerned because it's a very strange and confronting thing to ask a group of 3rd graders. I also noticed that Dylan wrote that he might have to love someone else if he had to, like you told him. I'd really like you to explain that," I asked her quite bluntly. "Oh, that," she replied as she let out a silent laugh. "Yesterday I was teaching about how parents love and protect their kids, but also how that there are also other people that would be there to help them if they need it." I wasn't satisfied with this answer and was about to question her further when suddenly a large group of school children entered the classroom. They were all walking in 2 rows. They all greeted Mrs. Wagner and greeted her one by one. They seemed very well behaved. almost too well behaved. I then saw Dylan take a seat next to one of the students who was staring to the front of the classroom with their arms crossed. At the entrance of the rest of the class, Dylan's behavior seemed to change. He seemed to sit up a bit straighter and his eyes widened as he began staring at the rest of the class. I looked around and noticed that all the students were staring at the same spot. All their eyes were pointed at Mrs. Wagner. Something didn't feel right, but I knew that Dylan needed to stay at school, and this was probably some sort of morning routine they had. I left, still with concerns about the homework. I decided to wait and see if any other strange homework would be set before I would take this matter further. I decided that I would pick Dylan up from school though, and so I left work a little bit early and drove over to the school. The school bell rang and soon all the students were dismissed and starting to come out of the school gate. Most of the kids came running and screaming out of the gate, apart from Mrs. Wagner's class. They all walked out in line, walking in time. This disturbed me. I'd never seen a group of students so well behaved, especially after the school bell had rung. Dylan walked over to the car and hopped in. He didn't say anything and sat in his seat, staring straight forward. I asked him if he was okay and he just replied with the word yes. I drove him home in silence, and when we got home and inside, Dylan went straight to his room and closed the door. I knew something was definitely wrong, but I didn't know what. I decided to leave him alone until my wife got home, and I would tell her everything that had been going on. She got home about a half an hour later, and I sat her down and explained everything that had been going on. She sat and listened and started to look more and more worried with every word I said. Maybe I should go talk to him, he might like that, she said once I had finished explaining everything. I agreed, and so she went into his room and I waited out in the lounge room for them to finish talking to each other. 15 minutes later, Dylan walked out of his room and into the lounge. He was holding a small workbook, and he said, "Can you help me with my homework, Dad?" "Of course, come show me what you need help with," I replied. He held out the notebook, and I took it out of his hands and read the homework task for the night. Written on the top line of the page was one task: research the best way to inject your parents with anesthetic. I barely finished reading the sentence when I felt this sharp pain in my neck, and I looked down and I saw the needle sticking out of the side of my neck. Dylan was holding the other end of the needle, a blank stare on his face. Everything started to go black, and the last thing I remember seeing is Dylan staring down at me as I lay on the floor. I don't know how long I was out, but I was awoken by my wife screaming and crying. I woke up, startled as she continued to scream. "He's gone. Dylan's gone," she kept screaming. I looked up at her, and the first thing I saw was a small pinprick that was on the side of her neck. She'd been injected too. I didn't know what to do, but I knew that I had to find my son. I tried my best to get up, but I think the drug hadn't properly worn off yet because I still couldn't move properly. I could move my arm, so I managed to get my phone out of my pocket and dial the police. I explained to them what had happened, and they said that they would send officers out and would begin looking for Dylan. I then noticed that it was 9 in the morning, and so I decided to ring the school and see if Dylan had gone there. I dialed, and a lady answered the phone. I asked if she had seen Dylan from Mrs. Wagner's class. "No, I'm very sorry, but we haven't seen him today. In fact, we haven't seen anyone from Mrs. Wagner's class today. They're all absent." Which is very odd because Mrs. Wagner hasn't shown up for work either today, the lady on the phone said. I hung up and sat in silence for a moment. My wife had heard what the lady said, so she also just sat there in total silence. That was all 3 weeks ago, and Dylan is still missing, along with Mrs. Wagner and the rest of his classmates. All the parents of the kids in Dylan's class have the same story. They were injected with something by their own children, and when they woke up, their child was gone. No one knows where they went, but we all had the same questions. Were they all together? Was Mrs. Wagner with them? Was this all planned? Why were all the students acting so strange in the days leading up to this? Were they hypnotized or drugged? Or maybe something even more sinister was happening? This story comes from Reddit user Pudenator. Thank you for allowing me to read your story.